We are joined today by Senator Jay Costa, Senate Minority Leader. What needs to be worked out before this year's state budget is passed?
Well, a number of items need to be worked out. Certainly, first and foremost, a budget number, so to speak, which is referred to as a spend number. And once we have agreement on what the spend number is, then we build a budget around that, focusing on priorities that Senate Democrats have, as well as our Republican colleagues, both in the House and the Senate, and House Democrats, and the administration as well. The governor's proposal is 51.4. I think now it's been increased to 51.5. We got to find the sweet spot with respect to that spend number, and then figure out what priorities are going to be within that. So that's first and foremost. Then we also have to recognize that we have some initiatives the governor's put forth with respect to generate revenue to put into the budget. We need to determine whether or not any of those are going to be part of the conversation, whether it be games of skill revenue, whether it be revenue from recreational cannabis, whether it be combined reporting that the governor's proposed. Those type of things will impact our revenue as well. We need to examine what is real and what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And then we need to then lay out some of the other initiatives, education spending, transit spending, and go right down the line, all the initiatives the governor's talked about through his budget proposal, and which ones will be there at the end of the day.
Republicans are concerned that the state would spend too much money if the governor's proposal is passed as it is now. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think we need to recognize that the governor has put forward a proposal which we think is reasonable and addresses how we're going to generate revenue along those lines to be able to support it. We also recognize that we have $3 billion as a surplus that we're sitting in sort of our account right now. And then we also have $7 billion that are sitting in our rainy day fund. So we believe that we do have the resources available to go forward to meet what the governor's proposed, which has been reasonable. $3 billion and then a small portion, I believe 1.5, 1.6 in the rainy day fund for this year, as a very reasonable, responsible proposal that addresses the initiatives that I think people want us to talk about, starting with education and making certain that we have appropriate care and reimbursement rates for our MCOs through the Medicaid program. Those are high priorities for Democrats and the administration, and we want to support those, and we will.
You mentioned a few times education being a key point of the budget this year, and there was a bill that recently passed the House to limit cyber charter schools to $8,000 in funding per student. How do you feel about this bill?
We certainly support limiting the cyber schools cost to $8,000. One area that we hear the most about from our school districts is the amount of money that they have to pay, particularly to our charter schools in particular, but cyber more specifically. And they believe that what they're reimbursed at far exceeds what it costs them to be able to educate kids through the cyber programs. And we know that because we know what our intermediate units are paying or costing them to be able to run the same program as effectively and as efficiently. So we know that, and then what we learned from the Auditor General's report, I believe, was that a number of these cyber school entities have enormous reserves, unnecessarily have these reserves, and that's a concern to us as well, how we get our arms around that. But it's indicative that the amount of money they're receiving far exceeds what they necessarily need to be able to educate the kids. So this is an important piece of legislation in terms of cyber reform. Last year, we did provide resources to our school districts to address the cyber school situation they're dealing with. But that was a one-time, one and done, I guess I would call it a grant or a line item. What we need is more reforms, more long-term sustainable reforms, including capping the amount of money they spend. And certainly as we go forward year after year, that could be adjusted. But that's just one of the reforms that I think we need to put into place, as well as several others.
What other aspects of education funding do you hope are included in this year's budget?
Well, certainly we're going to continue to fight for more resources in the early learning programs. The governor's been generous, and we think that's going to be important. So we're going to fight to maintain or maybe even grow that. Special education costs are important to us. Our career and technical schools are important to us, making sure we're putting resources there. And finally, in the higher ed, we need to put some resources there as well. We are one of the more challenging states with respect to our investments in public education. So we have to take steps to lessen that burden we put on our families. But I've been serving as one of the chairs of the Performance-Based Budgeting Commission for our 3 state-related universities, and we came out unanimously with a proposal that makes recommendations that we begin to have a real serious conversation about what our metrics are going to be and the goals within that and how we distribute those dollars. The governor's proposed $60 million to be allocated through that process, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to achieve that this upcoming year. But I think the most significant thing is the K-12 spending. We want to make sure we achieve the adequacy number the governor proposed, as well as the tax equity number, which is around $600 million. We also want to increase the basic education line item from $75 million to a much more significant number that would go to all 500 school districts. Right now, $75 million to 500 school districts, in my view, is not sufficient. We need to grow that line item along those lines. The adequacy and tax equity that came out of the court case and ultimately the basic education funding group, that goes to about 350 some school districts to address the inadequacy that's been sent to them in years past. So I think we need to address those areas in education spend. But we got to do it at a minimum what the governor's proposed.
The governor also proposed an increase in funding to public transit. What would you like that to look like?
I would like the governor's proposal to be passed. I'm pleased that the House has sent us a measure that does two things. It addresses the governor's budget proposal, which will be about $292 million by utilizing an additional portion of the state sales tax, again, without increasing it, just using an additional portion of it. But also coupled with that was 0.25 of that additional amount that would also address infrastructure repairs, roads and bridges. Over the years, we have known anytime we have done any type of transit or transportation increases in terms of spending from the state level, they've always been coupled together. Infrastructure or roads and bridges coupled with transit. And we know that that needs to be part of this conversation as well. So we want to make sure that we get the governor's proposal done, the amount he requested, as well as making sure we have investments in transportation, what I call transportation, roads and bridges investments in our infrastructure.
There were 3 points in the governor's budget proposal last year that were not included, which was recreational marijuana, regulating skill games, and raising the minimum wage. He reproposed those this year. Do you see any of those making it to the finish line this year?
My hope is that each of those get to the finish line. Let me start with the latter. Minimum wage increase, I think, we're an embarrassment in this country with respect to the low minimum wage we have, especially in the Northeast. Every state around us has a much higher minimum wage, I think the least of which is about $9 an hour. A lot of conversations have taken place over the years. The House has sent us over the last session, different forms of increases. They had sent us bills that would take it to 9, 11, or 11, 13 to 15 over 3 years. The most recent one would be a regional minimum wage that would allow for certain regions, certain classes of counties to be able to increase the minimum wage to a certain number, whether it be 11 or 13 or whatever the case might be for each of those counties. Right now, we have a statewide preemption, and I think that's part of the problem. That's what we're trying to get around. So by doing it regionally, we can also look at doing maybe a county region exemption, allowing without eliminating the statewide exemption, allow maybe local, first-class counties, second-class counties to be able to opt into a program that allows them to set their own minimum wage within reason at some number. So with the cost of living adjustment, those are some of the ideas that are percolating. I think we need to do that in that space. Second thing was skill games. That continues to be a conversation. A lot of folks are advocating for thus to regulate and tax it. I agree we need to do that. Status quo to me and members of my caucus is simply not acceptable. So as a result, we think there's an opportunity to generate revenue by taxing and regulating them that would address the issue with respect to, for example, as an alternative revenue stream to transit and transportation. That's been talked about. So I think we need to do that. The problem has been the tax rate. What should the tax rate be? Some have proposed 16%, others 35%, others 52% to have parity. We got to find that sweet spot. In addition to that, what are we going to charge for each one of those machines, and then the regulations that are associated with it? I believe that it needs to be very similar to our slot machines at our casinos or our VGTs at our truck stops, where they're tied directly into the Department of Revenue, and we monitor what's taking place there, as well as providing cameras and things of that nature that these facilities would need to have in place. So those are some of the things we're talking about in that space, but we haven't come to the conclusion or consensus, I should say, on the tax rate what the rates for individual machines would be, how many machines, and where would they be placed at? Are we going to limit them to licensees, for example, bars and restaurants that have liquor license? Are we going to expand it to other types of maybe the clubs, for example, VFWs and American Legions and the like? Are we going to allow them to go into grocery stores and the drugstores as we see them right now? That becomes the question that we have to resolve as well. And then finally, on recreational cannabis, the House has sent us a version. There's some concern about that language that came over. So I think that conversation will continue, but as we get further and further in this process without a comprehensive agreement on that thing, I think that's probably less likely to happen than the other two.
Lastly, how do this year's budget negotiations compare to last year's?
I think this year's are more difficult because we have external challenges that are taking place, certainly from Washington, not knowing what revenues we're going to have available to us. We receive a significant portion of our overall budget from federal dollars. We have state dollars, federal dollars, and we have other revenue sources that get us one large budget we typically enact. So the reliance upon federal dollars really is a pass-through and for us to be able to support programs, and it really creates an uncertainty with respect to I think House Resolution 1 would make draconian cuts to the Commonwealth. It would be in the Medicaid program, reducing the number of individuals who have access to that. Both our kids, our seniors, our nursing home facilities, our hospitals would be extremely impacted, who are already on slim margins and likely to close. The SNAP program is another program. Some of these things they're talking about doing are draconian, and they will have a major impact on our budget stuff. So it makes it difficult for us to put our arms around exactly what's going to be available to us. Not just this upcoming year for 25, 26, but 26 and 27 and beyond. So we have to factor all those things. So that's an external variable that's thrown into the mix that has made things more difficult, and that's what we're struggling with right now.
Senator Jay Costa, Senate Minority Leader, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.